Labrīt, dāmas kungi. Mans vārds Edijs Poga, esmu Zēžnāts advokāts, Biedrības Latvijas Tiesību institūta direktors. Biedrība Latvijas Tiesību institūts ir neatkarīga, nepolitiska, nevalstiska bezpēļņas apvienība, kurā apvienojušās personas ar kopīgām interesēm par Latvijas tiesībām un to tālāk attīstību. Institūts vienmēr visur darbojas neatkarīgi un stāv ārpus politisko partiju vestās politikas. Institūta misija ir veicināt Latvijas Republikas kā demokrātiskas taisnības un tiesību valsts tālāk atjaunošanu, nostiprināšanu, attīstību. Atgādinu, ka šī ir institūta ārvalstu akadēmiķu vieslekcijas programmas 5. gads, tātad tas jubilejas gads, un sākot ar šo gadu mēs esam iecerējuši sarīkot vismaz 2 vieslekcijas gadā. Šī ir 2018. gada 2. vieslekcija. Mūsu šodien cienījamais viesis ir karalienes padomnieks, Britu akadēmijas loceklis un Oksfordas universitātes profesors Pols Kreigs. Viņa vārds nevienam Eiropas Savienības tiesību zinātājiem nevar būt svešs un nekādus komentārus neprasa. Tādēļ, ka nav un nevar būt neviena Eiropas Savienības tiesību studenta nekur pasaulē, kas vismaz vienu reizi savā Eiropas Savienības tiesību mācību laikā nebūtu turējis rokā viņa slaveno mācību grāmatu. Ja? Nevēl šī grāmata akadēmiskās aprindās ir pazīstama kā Eiropas Savienības tiesību bībele, un patiešām jebkurš praktiķis, jebkura tiesa, gan nacionāla, gan Eiropas tiesa, kā arī jebkurš students un mācību spēks universitātēs visā pasaulē šo grāmatu lieto kā tādu kā bāzes mācību grāmatu. Un tādēļ, jo sevišķi prieks redzēt, ka profesors uzstāsies pie mums Latvijā. Profesora šodienas vieslekcijas tēma ir salīdzinoši plaša un interesanta, proti Eiropas Savienība un tās tiesību institucionālie un substantīvie izaicinājumi. Būs ļoti interesanti dzirdēt profesoru viedokli par to, kur Savienība dodās šajos satricinājumu laikos. Un sevišķi būs interesanti dzirdēt jautājums par demokrātisko deficītu Eiropas Savienībā un attiecīgi tās leģitimitāti un kā iespējams šos te problemātiskos aspektus varētu uzlabot. Tātad pasākuma formāts ierastais 2 stundas vieslekcija, kurai sekos vismaz 30 minūšu jautājumu atbilžu sesiju. Cerams, ka būs daudz jautājumu. Es aicinu jautājumus uzdot ne tikai par šodienas lekcijas priekšmetu, bet par jebkuru Eiropas Savienības tiesību jautājumu. Ja reiz mums tāda iespēja profesoram uzdot jautājumus tiešajā ir, tā kā es aicinu uzdot pēc iespējas maksimāli jebkuru interesējušu jautājumu, tā skaitā par Eiropas Savienības tiesību jautājumu, kas nav saistīti ar šodienas lekcijas priekšmetu. Kā ierasts Latvijas Tiesību institūta vārdā, es vēlos pateikties mūsu programmas atbalstītājiem. Tā ir Rīgas Latviešu biedrība, augstākā tiesa, Latvijas Zēžnātu advokātu padome, konkurences padome, tātad juristu vārds, Eiropas Savienības tiesību asociācija Latvijā, kā arī Zēžnātu advokātu biroja Eleks Kļaviņš un Everšets Sutherland Bitāns. Tas arī viss no manas puses, dāmas kungi. Man ir tas gods jūs priekšā stādīt profesoru Polu Kreigu un lūdzu viņu uzmundrināt ar aplausiem, kā vienmēr.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I can't say that I understood too many of them. My Latvian is not as good as it ought to be. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's my first time in Latvia. Been to Lithuania, but never to Latvia. And having seen Riga thus far, it looks a very beautiful city, having run around part of it this morning with my wife. So, let me begin. The lecture is entitled The EU and EU Law, Institutional and Substantive Challenges. So, it is commonplace to bemoan the EU's democratic deficiencies, and there is indeed a wealth of literature discussing the issue from a variety of perspectives. The lecture which follows is not intended to be a literature review. To the contrary, it advances my own view on the issue, albeit one that's informed by existing scholarship. My analysis is predicated, or the analysis in this lecture is predicated on the assumption that a principal, albeit not exclusive, cause for concern about EU democracy is the mismatch or the absence of fit between voter power and political responsibility. I claim no authorship of this point. It's been a point made in the literature on numerous occasions. EU decision-making is structured such that voters cannot determine directly or even pretty much indirectly the shape or direction of EU policy in the manner that occurs regularly to a greater extent within nation states. It is not therefore possible in the EU for the electorate to remove the incumbents from office and replace them with a different political party that has a different set of policies. It is this malaise that underlies Joseph Weiler's well-known critique of EU decision-making, captured in aphorismic terms by his affirmation of the centrality to democracy of the voters' ability to throw the scoundrels out. It's the same malaise that informs Miguel Maduro's critique to the effect that, quote, the real EU democratic deficit is the absence of European politics, manifest in the lack of democratic political contestation about the content and direction of EU policy. Properly understood, both of those critiques, the Weiler critique, the Maduro critique, are but two sides of the same coin. Now, the ensuing discussion, the discussion in this lecture, takes the same starting point as Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro. In other words, it takes the same starting point in the sense that although the term democratic deficit is used in a variety of ways, the core meaning or the central core assumption about democratic deficit is the point made by Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro. The inability of voters and voting to translate into a change of direction in political policy. That's a core democratic precept in pretty much any version of democracy. So my starting point is the same as Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro, but the direction of travel thereafter is rather different. And it's different because the direction of travel thereafter is directed firstly at who bears responsibility for this deficit. That's a pretty important question. It's a pretty straightforward question. It's a pretty seminal question. The assumption, explicit or implicit, in much of the literature, pretty much all of it, and certainly it's the assumption made by both Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro, is that the fault for this malaise resides principally with the EU as some reified entity. The pattern of this thought is strikingly simple, and it's shaped by the very cadence, rhythm of language. This is most marked in the duality of meaning accorded to the phrase, the EU's democratic deficit, in inverted commas. Think about it. That is used both descriptively to capture the malaise that I articulated above, and it is deployed normatively to connote the fact that the fault for this malaise resides with the EU, which is regarded as architect and author of the present reality. The academic line of argument thereafter flows naturally from the preceding duality of meaning. So the academic line of argument which follows takes the following form. Given that the democratic shortcoming resides descriptively and normatively with the EU, so democracy must remain in the member states, which are said to be the principal, the main sites for democratic legitimation. Some of the literature on what is called democracy is grounded in part at least on those assumptions. The discussion that follows in this lecture takes issue with that descriptive and normative linkage, and hence with the conclusions which are drawn therefrom. So this lecture is really going to have two big themes, if you want to call them big themes, but in any event it's going to have two principal theses. The first thesis is that the linkage between description and normative evaluation is wrong. It does not withstand examination. So the first line of argument is going to be that insofar as there is a democratic deficit of the kind that I articulated above, the first line of argument is that this flows from choices made expressly and repeatedly by the member states over time as to the institutional structure for decision-making which they are willing to accept. Those choices could have been different. There's no a priori block in this respect. There is, as I will demonstrate later, to the contrary, no especial difficulty in devising an EU decision-making regime that would meet the democratic shortcomings which I outlined above. Now, I am not claiming that the EU is blameless with respect to the mode of decision-making. That would be nonsense, and I try not to talk nonsense when I can avoid it. Nothing in the lecture is predicated on that assumption. Improvements could doubtless be made in the manner in which the principal EU institutions operate. That does not alter the fact that the treaty architecture that frames their respective powers and the way in which the EU institutions interrelate is the result of member state choice made and remade since the inception of the community. So that's going to be the first line of argument in this lecture. The second line of argument is as follows. It will also be argued, however, that there are four constraints to a fit between the institutional decision-making structure of the EU and the precepts of democracy. And I entitled those political, democratic, constitutional, and substantive. So a word by way of introduction to each of these constraints. The political constraint is premised on the assumption that some form of parliamentary majoritarian regime would meet the democratic deficit that I articulated earlier, a parliamentary democratic regime for the EU, thereby ensuring a closer nexus between voter preferences and political responsibility. Change of this kind would meet the democratic infirmity thus conceived. But it is very unlikely to occur precisely because the member states won't accept it and they won't accept it in the next 10 years any more than they would not accept it in the previous 50. It's not going to change. And I'll explain why they're not going to accept it a little later. The democratic constraint is expressive of the fact that there is, in any event, contestation as to whether a parliamentary type regime really is the most appropriate model for a polity such as the EU, or whether a different form of democratic ordering would be better fit for purpose. Again, I'll explain why later. The constitutional constraint denotes the fact that EU decision-making is limited by the very nature of the constituent treaties. Think about it in this way. It's very simple, like most important points. National constitutions constrain political choice. That is their very purpose. It is inherent in their very nature. The EU is no different in this respect in principle, in the sense that the founding treaties form the architecture to which legislation made thereunder must conform. The difference is one of degree, but it is significant nonetheless, since the EU treaties are far more detailed than any national constitution, and hence the room for democratic policy choice is more circumscribed. The final constraint, and I'll be talking about all of these in due course in the lecture, the final constraint is substantive. The substantive constraint speaks to the democratic consequences of the imbalance between the economic dimension of life and the social dimension of life within the EU, as manifest both in the original treaties and as a consequence of the financial crisis. So, let me begin then by sustaining the first part of the argument. To recall, the first part of the argument takes the following form. It is I'm accepting that the principal core idea of democracy deficit in the EU is the absence of fit between voter choice and the political direction of travel of the EU. We can vote for the EP, but change in the composition of the EP has no necessary connection with the direction of substantive policy which the EU is going to pursue. My thesis is accepting that that's a problem. I don't deny that. But the first part of the thesis which I'm advancing in this lecture is that that is a choice made expressly and repeatedly by the member states themselves from the very inception of the EU treaties right up to the present day. And while many issues in law and political science are contestable, this particular factual issue really isn't. It really isn't. So, let's just focus on the past, the institutional structure and democracy, the past. The community may only be 60 years old, but it's nonetheless easy to forget its institutional origins and the conception of democracy that existed or not, as the case may be at the outset. The reality was that the original disposition of power in the Rome Treaty saw little role for direct democratic input. The original 6 member states framed the treaty, and they accorded the Assembly almost no power. Its only role in the Rome Treaty was the only role in the legislative process was a right to be consulted, and that was only where a particular treaty article so specified. Over and beyond that, they had no role. The principal institutional players were the Council and the Commission, but in many respects, the Rome Treaty placed the Commission in the driving seat in the development of community policy. It was the Commission that had the right of legislative initiative. It could alter a measure before the Council acted. Its measures could only be amended by unanimity in the Council. The Commission, devised the overall legislative agenda, and it had a plethora of other executive, administrative, and judicial functions. So the message from the original treaty was that while the Council had to consent to proposed legislation, it was not easy for it to alter the Commission's proposal. The Commission might, on this view, have become something akin to a government for the emerging community, but that didn't quite happen. But the salient point for present purposes, just keeping our eye very firmly on the ball, original institutional architecture devised by 6 member states, very little room for anything akin to democratic input. Assembly existed, but it was on the fringes. It was a bit player in every sense, legally and factually, in the game. That vision, embodied in the treaties, was influenced by Monnet's vision for Europe and by the form of political science known as neo-functionalism. Monnet's conception of Europe, which was itself very influential, was strongly influenced by the role of technocrats trained in the French Grandes Écoles. It served to explain the structure of the ECSC and the centrality of the high authority therein, which embodied Monnet's technocratic approach. There was to be a corporatist style involving networks of interest groups, and that was institutionalized in the ECSC. That same general structure was carried over to the EEC. Okay? It was carried over to the EEC. What we had in the EEC was a pattern which has been described, I think, accurately in 57, 58 by one commentator as enlightened administration on behalf of uninformed publics in cooperation with affected interests and subject to the approval of national governments. That was the compromise struck in the treaties of Rome. While Monnet himself favored a democratic community, he saw the emergence of loyalties to the community institutions developing as a consequence of elite agreements for the functional organization of Europe, not as an essential prerequisite to that organization. So, that was the past. Let us now move to the present, and by the present I mean where we are now, but also the intervening period. So what happened in this intervening period? Okay, what happened in the intervening period in terms of changing patterns of institutional structure? So, what happened in broad terms was this. Nothing happened for the first 30 years of the community's existence, all right? So when you say, what happened? Well, nothing happened, and nothing happening is still something happening, it's nothing happening. So the principal institutional structure was unaltered from 57, 58 to 86 with the passage of the Single European Act. Yes, there was expansion of the community. Yes, there was merger of the treaties. But subject to that, basically nothing changed in terms of the core institutional decision-making structure. The first real change started to happen with the Single European Act in 1986, and this was the first time in which the European Parliament started coming from the fringes to become more of a player in European decision-making. And that happened because of the introduction in the 86 Single European Act of what became known as the cooperation procedure, which gave the European Parliament voice in the legislative process, real voice for the first time. And particularly because that procedure, the cooperation procedure, was attached to the process, to decision-making under what was Article 100A, now Article 114, the TFEU, when harmonization initiatives were enacted to complete the single market. So the EP had a foot in the door. Note, however, that, and because people forget this, and why shouldn't they? But they do, but it shouldn't. The concession given to the EP in the 86 Single European Act was only after the member states had truly kicked sand in the face of the EP, because what happened in the run-up to the 86 Single European Act was that the Parliament had proposed a new draft treaty, which would have been much more democratic and much more majoritarian, etc. A draft treaty on the European Union, basically, in the run-up to the 86 Single European Act. The member states kicked sand in the face of the EP. They kind of just pushed it away. So the concession of the cooperation procedure was very much, well, we'll give you something. You know, here's a little something to keep you happy. We're not buying into the broader frame that you have suggested. Now, the story thereafter, again, will be familiar to most people who know about EU law. The Parliament has increased its power thereafter. It got its foot in the door. It got its foot in the door through the Single European Act of 1986 and the cooperation procedure. That was then followed in the Maastricht Treaty by the creation of the co-decision procedure, and the co-decision procedure was then strengthened and extended in terms of its sphere of substantive operation by the Amsterdam Treaty in 96-97. Okay, so the European Parliament has in some respects become a co-legislator with the Council, and that is formally affirmed in the Lisbon Treaty when describing the respective powers of the Council and the European Parliament. But, and there was always going to be a but, so here's the big but. But note, the whole structure, present structure of institutional decision-making that we have now in the EU has been controlled and shaped throughout by the member states. The member states, it is simply unarguable, were the principal architects of Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, and Lisbon. Indeed, the general consensus is that the Commission punched below its weight when both the Constitutional Treaty was being devised and when the Lisbon Treaty was being devised. And that's particularly important because, in effect, pretty much everything new in the Lisbon Treaty has its origins in the Constitutional Treaty. Now, why is that important? It's important because while the European Parliament has, over the years, increased its democratic input, and quite rightly, absolutely rightly, it's also true that member state influence in the decision-making process has also increased markedly over time. The European Council has become the ultimate repository of member state power. And the bottom line now is that de jure and de facto, nothing important happens in the EU. Nothing important happens in the EU without the imprimatur, without the approval of the European Council, consisting of the heads of state of the 28 member states. Now, this is really very significant, and it was also clear for those like myself who followed closely the debates about the interinstitutional division of power in the Constitutional Treaty, which were then carried over into the Lisbon Treaty. It was clear that the member states were absolutely definite in their own mind that they were going to retain the controls of the direction of travel of the EU, and that the present disposition of interinstitutional power embedded in the Lisbon Treaty affirms that that policy assumption and normative assumption by the member states. So I reiterate what I said earlier. What we have now is a consequence of what the member states over time have been willing to accept. And I'm going to drill this point down a little bit further and just press it a little bit further. Let us be absolutely clear. This predominance of member state influence over the institutional architecture of the EU is not a one-off. It didn't only happen with the Lisbon Treaty. It didn't only happen with the Nice Treaty. It didn't only happen with the Constitutional Treaty. It happened with all of them, all the way through. So I repeat, insofar as we have a democratic malaise, insofar as that exists, then it is a democratic malaise which informs the treaties as a result of the member state choice. Now, the consequences of the realization of that, I think, really fairly straightforward but nonetheless fundamental point is something that I will come back to, okay? But for the moment, let us move on to looking at the institutional structure and democracy for the future. Okay. Now, I stated earlier that it's not political rocket science to devise a method of decision-making for the EU which would meet the democratic infirmities that I laid out at the beginning. It's not impossible to devise a mode of decision-making that would address, in principle, the concerns raised by writers such as Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro. Okay? So, and actually we could work out a pretty detailed schema right now. As I said, you don't have to do a PhD to work this one out. Thus, just think about it. If you want to address the kind of concerns that Joseph Weiler has and that Miguel Maduro has, here's a way you could do it. You could have a parliamentary model, and it would be possible to have that regime in which people voted directly for two constituent parts of the legislature, the EP and the Council. It would be possible to have a regime in which they voted directly for the President of the Commission and the President of the European Council. It will be possible, in theory, to have that package, but only a single elected president for the EU as a whole. It will be possible for the entire Commission to be reflective of the majority party in the EP, not just the President of the Commission. It would be possible for the EP to have a right of legislative initiative in tandem or in parallel with that of the Commission. It is possible indeed to devise such a schema with conditions to protect against undesirable consequences of majoritarianism. The linkage between electoral power, substantive policy choice, and accountability would then be more visible, and it would be strengthened. Now, there are necessary qualifications to that model, but it provides a useful starting point for discussion. Now, let me then move on to the, as it were, second theme of these lectures, the four constraints. Okay? The four constraints. The first constraint is straightforwardly political. The principal reason why nothing akin to the preceding model is likely to occur follows directly from what I've laid out in the first part of this lecture. The member states are the main architects of treaty change, and they have never been willing to accept such a disposition of power. We must remember the past when planning the future. It's true that the choice between two presidents for the EU and a single president was debated during the negotiations which led to the constitutional treaty. It's equally true that discourse concerning the election of the Commission president began in the 80s. Notwithstanding that, the broader reforms that I just set out on this slide, the previous slide, were not on the political agenda at any time in the community's history. And they were not on the agenda in the extensive discussions which led to the Constitutional Treaty in 2003-04, nor in the subsequent discussions that culminated in the Lisbon Treaty. The reason why nothing akin to the preceding model has ever appeared in formal discussion of treaty reform is not hard to divine. The member states would lose power in relative and absolute terms. They would no longer be masters of the treaty. The preceding parliamentary model, or anything akin thereto, would alleviate the democratic deficit as conceived by Weiler and Maduro, but in doing so, it would endow the elected majority in the EP and the duly elected presidents of the Commission and the European Council with a mandate and an authority to discharge the promised electoral pledges. This would be a fortiori the case if members of the Council were also directly elected. Such a regime would inevitably significantly circumscribe member state room for maneuver. It would, to borrow from the terminology of political science, create a substantive path dependency as to the direction of policy and the priorities to be fulfilled. It is therefore unsurprising that nothing akin to this has featured in serious political deliberations concerning the direction of institutional change within the EU. Now, we can reinforce that basic political constraint by various other facts out there which reinforce this first political constraint. And I've set out a number of lessons which are set out on these slides, which I'll then expand on. So what we're doing is we're taking the political constraint that I've just said and reinforcing it by a number of further observations. So the first one is lessons from the Spitzenkandidaten process. Now, those who do EU law will be familiar with this. This was the minor democratic revolution in the 2015 EP elections, whereby the major parties in the EP put up a candidate for Commission President, and it became accepted that the group which had the majority in the EP, their candidate would indeed be made Commission President. And that clearly gave some indirect legislative and voter imprimatur approval to the person who became Commission President. Okay? Now, that was heralded, and I think rightly, as a change in the right direction, as a move towards greater voter power, because voters would vote for people in the EP. The EP would have its candidate for Commission President, and the party which got the most votes, its candidate became Commission President. So an indirect form of voter legitimation. Now, while everyone got rather excited about this at the time and thought that this was the start of a new change which would alleviate the democratic deficit and that it would begin meeting the problems that Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro had put on the table, although I was in favor of it, was always rather more skeptical about it. My take on it was always that actually the member states accepted the Spitzenkandidaten process because actually it didn't make that much difference. It didn't make that much difference. Why? Because, okay, Juncker was the party candidate of one particular party in the EP, but that didn't mean that that party's policies necessarily got translated into Commission policy. It didn't mean that. Why not? Because he had 27 other commissioners who weren't from the same party. There was no linkage between the 27 other commissioners and the Commission President. The Commission President may be primus inter pares, but he or she is not more than that. Moreover, the Commission President was sitting there constrained by the existence of the continued power of the Council and even more so the European Council. So my take about the 2015 Spitzenkandidaten process was, yeah, great, nice move in the same direction. No, I didn't see this as suddenly the fulcrum point on which everything would suddenly change and modify very quickly. What's really interesting in this respect is the 2018 retrenchment from the Spitzenkandidaten process. What happened in 2018 is that Juncker went to the European Council. Now, this may change, but this is what they've said so far. Juncker went to the European Council and said, can you give us a guarantee that the Spitzenkandidaten process will happen in the 2019 elections as well? And they said, no. Nope, sorry, we're not giving you that. And it was clear that that was not just a sort of knee-jerk reaction, we're not giving you that now, but we might give it to you later. It actually was a deeper pattern of thought. Tusk, speaking on behalf of the European Council, came back to Juncker and said, look, the treaty regime laid down, the treaty articles in the TEU are very clear. We make the judgment call ultimately on who should be Commission President in the light of a recommendation made by the European Parliament. And that's how it's going to be. We're not going to assume that your recommendation is automatically a shoo-in to the job. So pushback from the member states, even against the Spitzenkandidaten process. Again, reflective of political constraints imposed by the member states, unwillingness to give up even the degree of power that they'd given up in the Spitzenkandidaten process in 2015. Second lesson, when Juncker came to the table saying, we're going to have, I'd like to have your affirmation that we can have the Spitzenkandidaten process in 2019, he also, I think rather more surprisingly, came to the table and said, oh, and by the way, what do you think about the idea of there only being one president for the EU, me, rather than two presidents, me and you being me, President of the European Commission, and you, the President of the European Council. Now, although I'm quite willing to give prizes for intellectual thought and acuity, I'm not willing to give a very large prize when you work out that the likely response of the European Council to that suggestion was resoundingly negative. They were not impressed by that idea. They had rejected that idea in the constitutional treaty, and there was no way in which they were going to accept that there was going to be one president for the EU who was going to be the president of the Commission. So the idea that the Commission President should be double-hatted, functioning both as chair of the European Council and as Commission President, didn't get off the ground. Again, actually, I mean, my own view on that, there were big debates about this. This is what academics do. There were big debates about this at the time of the Constitutional Treaty when we talked about this. And some people thought that having a single president would work and having two presidents would be complicated. I always took the other view. It seems to me, leave aside the politics altogether, I actually think the operational workings of a regime in which you only have one president who was double-hatted, functioning both as president of the Commission and as president of the European Council, would lead to all sorts of difficulties and conflicts of interest. Actually, I think that the present regime of having two presidents has, on the whole, worked pretty well over time. I'm not saying it's worked perfectly, but I think that the problems of its operation and working would be very considerably greater if you only had one president. Okay, further lesson, constitutional courts. If you moved to a regime which would alleviate the democratic deficit in the way that Maduro and Weiler have articulated, if we move to a more parliamentary model, what would happen in national political terms? Well, I can tell you one thing which would happen, and again, I don't claim any points or prizes for this startling bit of logic, but what would happen is that before the ink was dry on the relevant treaty amendment or change, there would be an action filed in the Bundesverfassungsgericht where someone argued that Germany could not sign up to a treaty of that kind because it would be unconstitutional in German law, because the member states under such a parliamentary regime would truly no longer be the masters of the treaty, and that therefore it was simply constitutionally out with the power of the German government to sign up to such a treaty. And I think other constitutional courts might well go the same way. And then you get national parliaments. National parliaments are great. They're terrific. Except, like all political institutions, they do sometimes play a little bit fast and loose in the following sense. They want, like all of us, to have our cake and eat it at the same time. It's a natural human inclination, and it's a natural institutional inclination as well. Having your cake and eating it in this context means the following. It means national parliaments being able repeatedly to criticize the EU for being relatively undemocratic, with the consequence of saying democracy must continue to reside with us at the nation-state level, and us, the national parliaments in particular. So they want, on the one hand, to be able to say that, and then if someone puts before them change which would meet the democratic infirmities about which they are complaining, they would resist that change, and have resisted such change precisely because such change would increase the democratic legitimacy of the EU and diminish, in relative terms, the power of nation states and national parliaments therein. So, that's one constraint. That's simply one constraint on meeting the democratic deficit, what I call the political constraint. There is a second constraint, and the second constraint follows from the first, but it is distinct, okay? It is distinct, and it's what I call the democratic constraint. Okay, and let me explain the nature of this constraint. The EU has always been grounded in two patterns of representation. The people are represented in the European Parliament, state interests are represented in the Council and the European Council. It is clear that reforms to alleviate the democratic deficit by increasing the connection between electoral power and political responsibility focus primarily on the first mode of representation, the connection between voter choice, the EP, and the shaping of the EU policy agenda. Okay? Now, the reality is, even if the broader package of reforms that I set out beforehand, the reality is that even if that broader package of reforms was adopted, it could not ensure that the people would exercise electoral control over the direction of EU policy, since the European Council would still be populated by heads of state who would continue to have a marked influence over the policy agenda. So the second mode of representation via state interests would perforce constrain the first, and this would be so even if the President of the European Council were to be directly elected. And that is particularly important given the centrality of the European Council to agenda setting and the choice of priorities, such that, as I mentioned earlier, nothing significant happens in the EU without the imprimatur, the approval of the European Council. Now, we might say, okay, there's nothing unusual in this respect, since it's a standard feature of national federal systems that there is a duality of representations. The normal pattern being that state interests and those of the people are dealt with in different parts of the legislature. It might be argued, look, that duality doesn't present the offering of a coherent package to the electors. The two modes of representation do not therefore hinder the foundational democratic precept, viz., i.e., that the voters choose who should represent them and the direction of policy, with the consequence that if parties fail to satisfy voter choice, they pay the price at the ballot box. Now, that national analogy is instructive precisely because it does not replicate at EU level. There is some similarity insofar as both the EU and federal systems are premised on two modes of representation, the people and the states. But the similarity is superficial and conceals deeper differences. The reality is that there is a hierarchy between the two modes of representation, which do not naturally coexist on an equal footing. In federal states, the paradigm is that representation of the people has primacy, or that there is parity between such representation and that of states. That does not hold true for the EU, where state representation through the Council and the European Council is more powerful than that of the people in the EP. So, in federal parliamentary regimes, just think about it at the state level. In federal parliamentary regimes, there are commonly two component parts of the legislature, with the political agenda commonly set by the House elected by the people, with state interests as represented in the other House able to exert influence on the legislation. In federal presidential systems such as the USA, the balance of power between the elected houses may be different, but it does not alter the point being made here, because voters have voice in relation to both houses, given that the incumbents are directly elected on party political tickets, Republican or Democratic, and given also that substantive policy will be set to some extent by the president, who's directly elected. So connection between voter choice and policy direction is preserved. Okay? Now, what's important and instructive in the EU over time, and not fortuitous, is that the converse pertains as to the hierarchy between the two modes of representation. It is representation of state interests that's accorded primacy, de jure and de facto through the Council and the European Council, with representation of the people through the European Parliament being secondary. And that is apparent historically, and it's apparent from the treaty provisions that we currently have. Now, the reasons why that is so are not hard to divine. So we looked at the political tableau, but if you stand back and think of the reasons which are driving that, other than the pure retention of state power, and drill a bit deeper, then we get to more interesting arguments. The real reasons for the difference between the nation state and the EU in this respect are, as I've just said, not hard to divine. Representation of state interests within a federal polity and within the EU are markedly different. Why? At state level, there is a commonality of interest, a shared identity, and solidarity, which is considerably greater within a nation state, even one which is federal, than in the EU. By way of contrast, problems of domination of one state over another are considerably greater in the EU than in a nation state. And that's true even in a federal state where different regions may have different degrees of power. So it's important, therefore, to view proposals. It's important, therefore, to view proposals concerning alleviation of the democratic deficit against that backdrop. The reality is, as I've mentioned earlier, but it's worth coming back to the point, the reality is that such proposals entail a reordering of the hierarchy in the modes of representation as they pertain in the EU. Representation of the people is afforded an elevated status as manifest in the desire that voter choice be translated into political action, and that the gulf between electoral power and political responsibility is either eradicated or significantly diminished. That necessarily involves reduction in power wielded by the institutions that represent state interests. Okay? Now, it might be argued by way of response that that rebalancing is precisely what is intended, to which the counter is that the states are unlikely to accept the substantive path dependency and loss of power that would be attendant on this change, and they are unlikely to accept that precisely because, as between states, there is not the same sense of commonality of interest, shared identity, and the like, which is the cornerstone of the modus operandi of democracy in the nation state. So, the bottom line here is, if you're going to move towards a more parliamentary model, it couldn't be a pure parliamentary majoritarian model. Now, there are models out there, and I don't have time to go into the detail. There are models out there, but if you are going to address the democratic deficit, a straightforward parliamentary model won't do it because of the point that I've just been making in terms of the democratic constraint. What you'd have to do is draw on patterns of thought, and there is quite a lot of stuff out there about consociational democracy or consensus democracy, where you have bicameral legislatures, but also you build into the decision-making mechanism rules about supermajoritarian decision-making and you build in rules which are designed to protect the interests of minority groups, which in this context might well include small states. So, to take stock, the second problem facing change or reform in the EU is what I've called the democratic constraint, the meaning of democracy that should be applied within the EU legal and political order. Okay, third constraint. The third constraint is what I call the constitutional constraint. Now, it is standard fare, completely unexceptionable and normal, that constitutions restrict choices that can be made via everyday politics. You elect people in nation states, they make all sorts of policies and promises, some they keep, some they don't keep, some they intend to keep, some they never intend to keep, whatever. But whatever policy choices they make those policy choices subject to constraints laid down in the Constitution. Another fancy way, but nonetheless accurate way of putting that, is that constitutions, by their very nature, entail some pre-commitment, which confines choices that can be made thereafter, subject, of course, to any constitutional amendment. The pre-commitment that you find in constitutions can be procedural or substantive. Procedural in the sense that some constitutions will say, you can do certain stuff, but only if you do it in this way. This way might be an affirmative vote in both branches of the legislature, it might be supermajoritarian requirements, it might be a requirement to hold a referendum, whatever. All of those are pre-commitments which are procedural. They might be, alternatively, substantive. Substantive commitments, pre-commitments, can, again, they can vary. They can take the form of a division between what you can do at federal level and what you can do at state level. They can entail substantive limits on what the current legislature can do in terms of infringing fundamental rights. So, looked at in this way, most bills of rights constitute a pre-commitment by those who made the Constitution to say, yes, you can pass whatever legislation you like, but it can't operate in a discriminatory fashion, or it can't limit freedom of speech, etc., etc., etc. Now, at the EU level, in principle, is no different, okay? Constitutionalism or constitutionalization performs the same function, in principle. But there is a difference in degree, and the difference in degree is huge. Okay? Huge. Because the reality at the EU level is that, as presently conceived, everything in the treaties is constitutionalized. Okay? Everything in the treaties is constitutionalized. And what do I mean by that? So what I mean is this. Again, let's focus very clearly, not lose sight of the wood for the trees, etc. Keep our eye on the ball. What we're concerned with when looking at this constitutional constraint is the ability of a reinforced, re-empowered Parliament to make policy choices which it puts down in its brief to the electors and say, you elect us, we'll do this, 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 and this. Okay? Now, I just said, at national level, that's constrained by the Constitution. And at EU level, it's constrained by the Constitution as well. But it's constrained by the Constitution, meaning the treaties, in a much more dramatic way. In a much more dramatic way, because the treaties embody 300 plus articles, which are all, in relative terms, constitutionalized. So it's not open to a particular party. Supposing you've got a left of centre party. Supposing you've got a left of centre party, and the left of centre party wants to appeal to the electorate and say, actually, we're going to play down all this capitalist free market stuff about free movement, and we're going to accord greater weight to social policy in relative terms. Okay? Now, that kind of policy choice is something which a nation state might do all the time, and that's the kind of choice that is put on the left-right political spectrum at nation-state level. What I'm saying is that the constraint of constitutionalization means that that's not possible at the EU level, because it's not open to a particular political party at a particular point in time to go to the electors and say, well, yeah, the treaties say this, this, and this, but don't worry about it, we're going to do something different. They can't make that choice. You can't alter what's said in the treaties unless you amend the treaties. And amending the treaties in any way at present is pretty difficult. Fundamentally amending them is almost impossible at present. So that is a constraint on normal, everyday political choice, and the kind of choice that a party seeking office would put to the electors. Okay? And these concerns about constitutionalization have been raised in the academic literature. They've been raised most eloquently and elegantly by Dieter Grimm, the German professor who was also on the Bundesverfassungsgericht for a period of time, but has now returned to academia, who has related in detail the effect of taking this broad tranche of matters off the agenda of normal politics. And he's talked about exactly the concerns that I have just addressed. Note here that these concerns as to over-constitutionalization, those concerns are exacerbated by the constitutional doctrines of direct effect and supremacy. And I'm not saying that those constitutional doctrines are wrong, I'm merely saying that they add a further overlay of constitutionalization onto the fact that the provisions are in the treaties. So not only are these provisions like the fundamental four freedoms in the treaties, that's one level of constitutionalization, so that political parties can't mess with them and say, well, don't worry about it, we're not going to give priority to this after all. It's not just that they're in the treaties, it's in addition the fact that direct effect and supremacy invests those treaty provisions with a force and a direction which they would otherwise lack. It gives individuals rights which they can enforce in their own nation state. And it gives those provisions a peremptory force which they would otherwise lack. And in that sense, it further constrains member state room for maneuver. Now, these concerns as to over-constitutionalization have led Dieter Grimm, after an elegant argument, to say, well, the solution is to remodel the treaties. That bit of the argument Dieter Grimm does not take forward in detail, And that's because it's pretty impossible to do it. I mean, it's all very well suggesting how you... I mean, actually, truth to tell, the great shame in this respect is that had we gone with the constitutional treaty model of treaty architecture, then it would have been much easier to do what Dieter Grimm is suggesting. And the reason for that is simple. Under the constitutional treaty, you had actually a much more eloquent and elegant pattern of treaty architecture than is in the Lisbon Treaty. We had a part 1 which really did include the constitutional principles. We had part 2 which was the Charter of Rights. We had part 3 which was all the substantive policy stuff. And then we had part 4 which was transitional and final arrangements. Now, in the model, if you wanted to do what Dieter Grimm is doing, much easier to do that. Much easier to do that with a constitutional treaty model than with the Lisbon model, because if there was enough political will to do it, then you could basically say part 3, or what was part 3 of the constitutional treaty, we're downgrading that. It isn't constitutional in the way that part 1 is. It would be possible to make a change of that kind, given the treaty organization at the time. But it hasn't happened. Okay. There's another dimension to constitutional constraints on making the EU more democratic. And it's about competence. So this is a completely different kind of constitutional constraint, but equally important. And again, the point actually, like most important points, is remarkably simple, or pretty simple, but important nonetheless. And it's this. We work on the assumption that in the nation state that nation states have plenary power. Okay, subject to the Constitution, the state can regulate anything within its territorial boundaries, etc. Okay, it has full authority over all aspects of life, subject to the Constitution and any other international commitments that it's entered into. Okay, so what you get in a normal election is contestation with one party saying, we're going to offer you this, we're going to offer you these green policies, these economic policies, these social policies, etc. And someone else is coming along saying, no, the package we're going to offer you is this, 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 and this. That's the lifeblood of everyday political contestation within nation states. The assumption in the EU is very different. There is a vertical and a horizontal dimension to limits on competence. The vertical dimension's obvious, which is that the EU only has the competence accorded to it by the constituent treaties. And that in turn limits the scope of political choices that can be put before the electorate in EU elections. A political party cannot go to the electorate in the EU and saying, we're going to do the following wholesale redistributive tax reforms, which will help those who are less well off, who will tax the rich more, and then we're going to redistribute the money in the following way. They can't do it. They can't even think of doing it because the EU does not have competence over direct taxation, and it does not have competence over social policy to the required extent to make those promises or forge those connections. So the room for democratic play of political choice is circumscribed by the competence given to the EU. And then you've got the horizontal dimension, which is that not or heads of competence possessed by the EU are, in inverted commas, created equal. So even where the EU has competence, it doesn't necessarily have the same degree of competence over all areas. There is the fundamental distinction between exclusive, shared, and complementary competence, which plays out in the EU treaties. And in addition to that, for those who really understand EU law, even within each of these areas, such as shared competence, the degree of power possessed by the EU in one area of shared competence does not necessarily translate into the same degree of power that it has in a different area of shared competence. Okay. Finally, within this, a final dimension, a further dimension of the constitutional constraint before I come on to the substantive constraint, a further dimension of it is the fact, and we're seeing this play out time and again in the EU, and it's one of the tragedies, truly, not to use that word advisedly, it's one of the tragedies of the EU. There is a mismatch between the limits of competence of the EU and the expectation of what the EU should do. And it's exemplified by the rule of law crisis, as it has been termed. And by the rule of law crisis, for those who are not familiar with that language, we mean the rule of law crisis of the kind that is ongoing in Poland, has existed in Hungary, did exist to some extent in Romania, parties in office at national level interfering with the rules for appointment and decision-making by courts in a way which is fundamentally contrary to the rule of law. Now, the EU is to some extent caught between a rock and a hard place in this respect. And it is a kind of one of the tragedies of the dilemmas faced by the EU at the moment. There's no doubt that the principal responsibility for the crisis resides with the states that introduced the illiberal measures threatening the rule of law. You've got to call a spade a spade. The EU didn't introduce those measures, of course not. They're totally against them. Now, I know that there are commentators and scholars and politicians in Poland who defend the changes that have been made, and I'm not going there, I'm not getting into that. That's not part of what I'm talking about today. Though I should also say that I don't accept those arguments. I have looked at those arguments in detail, partly from other work I've done, partly because one of the other jobs I have is that I'm one of the UK representatives on the Venice Commission, and the Venice Commission has investigated all this stuff in Poland and Hungary in a great deal of detail, and found the Polish arguments wanting in the extreme. Okay, so the principal responsibility lies with the member states. But then everyone says, right, it's a member. Poland's a member of the EU. Hungary's a member of the EU. The EU should do something. The EU has a collective responsibility to try and sort this problem out. Okay. I'm not denying that. The EU's not denying that. But, of course, the paradox is that, once again, what the EU can do is bounded, at least at the beginning, by the treaty provisions. And that means principally the mechanisms for penalties and the like contained in Article 7 of the TEU. The problem about Article 7 is that when Article 7 was drafted by the member states, no one actually thought there was going to be more than one bad guy in a non-gender specific sense. No one thought there was going to be more than one bad member state at any one point in time. The problem then in the decision-making mechanism in the EU under Article 7 is if Poland and Hungary stick together, then and neither of them vote against the other, and they have a pact, then in effect, you render Article 7 and the kick-starting of Article 7 almost impossible. Okay? So actually, the EU has then been quite creative recently. And people equivocate about this creation or this creativity. Being creative in two ways, both of which I think are legally and politically correct, but I agree that that's a matter of opinion. This is a matter of opinion. So one road they've gone down is a suggestion which has been made by a number of academics in the past, and which I think makes perfectly good sense, which is you go after them with monetary sanctions. So you want to get the attention of these countries, you don't just fire from the hip with language that you're breaking the rule of law. You say, okay, fine, your block grant from the EU in terms of structural fund money or whatever is now diminished by 40%. You will get their attention in that way. Whether it changes policies is another matter, but you will get the state's attention. The other is a purely legal way, is actually to bring enforcement actions against the member states under 258 and 259. And again, for a breach of some of the fundamental principles on which the EU has been founded. And recent jurisprudence of the court has given a kind of pretty much a green light to the possibility of such actions. In any event, what I'm highlighting here is nonetheless, not because we could spend a whole lecture just talking about the rule of law crisis, that's not the point here. What I'm highlighting is the fact that there is a mismatch between the EU is expected to do a lot, but it hasn't necessarily been granted express competence to enable it to do that. So it's had to work creatively. And then when working creatively, it's at risk of being shot at from two sides at the same time. On the one hand, it's at risk of being shot at by people saying, you are interfering too much in nation states. This is not your problem, get off our turf. And on the other hand, they're at risk of people saying, what you're doing is ineffectual. You're damned if you do too much, you're damned if you do too little. It's one of the dilemmas of the rule of law crisis, but if I had time, and I do not, if I had time, similar, a not dissimilar pattern affects the migration crisis as well. It affects the migration crisis as well. The EU, just very briefly on this, has tried within the limits of its competence to put on the table various policy proposals that would try and meet the migration crisis in a manner which was reasonably fair and equitable as between the 28 member states, and the 28 member states have flatly rejected those proposals. They are not willing, or they do not regard themselves as having a sufficient commonality of interest and shared identity to embrace those changes. All right, finally, fourth and final constraint, the substantive constraint. What I term the substantive constraint on alleviating the democratic deficit is as follows. It's the balance between the economic dimension and the social dimension of EU policy. And this has been a continuous feature of the EEC since its inception, and it's still true now. Fritz Sharp from Germany, German political scientist, put forward very elegantly, once again, the core idea of this problem, or the core reason why it's a problem. And the argument goes roughly like this. It says the EU embodies an asymmetry between the economic and the social. The former is prioritized at the expense of the latter. The economic order has predominated. That's evidenced by the treaty provisions, the centrality of the four freedoms, and the primacy accorded to completion of the single market, with the attendant priority placed on market and competitive principles. He then says, that's what you get in the treaties, this asymmetry. Says, contrast that with the nation state. At the national level, economic and social policy have the same constitutional status. Nothing's to stop the nation state saying we're going to trade off this amount of economic policy against social policy, vice versa. That kind of interplay is what you get in national politics all the time. The consequence, however, of the asymmetry between the economic and the social at EU level is that not only is there an asymmetry at EU level, but it has a trickle-down effect at national level because it reduces the member states' ability to influence their own economies or to realize their own self-defined social and socio-political goals. And the doctrines of direct effect and supremacy, once again, heighten that asymmetry and heighten those constraints. It's an important thesis, okay? And there's simply no doubt that that imbalance exists. And again, relating it back to our core argument in this paper, the core argument and core theme of this paper, the fact that that imbalance is there constrains the space within which democratic political choice can take place. It frames in a very marked manner the choices which any democratic party in government can put on the table. There are nonetheless, as it were, three paradoxes which are evident, not in Sharp's thesis, but in relation to this issue, the imbalance between the social and the political. Okay? The first paradox is that it was, and demonstrably the case in causal historical terms, concerns as to the balance between the social and the economic were the catalysts for the treaty reforms increasing the EU's power over social policy in the 1990s. So when you had amendments to the treaties increasing the EU's power over social policy, those concerns, that those amendments were driven by a real perception that there was an imbalance between the social and the economic. Second paradox, insofar as there is a continuing imbalance between the economic and the social within the EU, that is the result of member state choice. So again, not lose sight of that. Just as the current institutional structure is the result of member state choice, the balance between the social and the economic is the result of member state choice. They could have changed it more fundamentally at any time. It reflects the limits of power that member states are willing to accord to the EU. Third paradox is the most truly paradoxical of the paradoxes, as it were. The third paradox is the very desire to preserve national sovereignty underpinned member state reluctance to accord the EU power over social policy. So it was the very desire to preserve national sovereignty underpinned member state reluctance to accord the EU power over social policy. Yet, the resulting predominance of the economic over the social within the EU impacted and constrained member state freedom to choose the balance between the economic and the social within the nation state. Okay. There's a second big aspect to this substantive constraint. So far, I've looked at the economic and the social in the way that I just did. But there's also an aspect of this substantive constraint which plays out in the following way. You get tensions between the economic, the social, and the political in relation to the financial crisis, the EMU crisis. It has impacted on the balance between the economic sphere and the social sphere, both at EU level and at nation-state level. Both. At EU level, the financial crisis has meant that the EU's energies over the last pretty much getting up to a decade now have been concentrated on resolving economic problems with scant energy left for thinking about broader social policy. So in that sense, it's reinforced the tension. At national level, the financial crisis has also had a serious impact. Relief for debtor states, Greece being a prime example, but not only Greece, Spain and Portugal were subject, and Ireland was subject to the similar pattern. Relief for debtor states is subject to strict conditionality requirements, which have imposed strict austerity limits on national spending, with attendant implications for national social and welfare policy. Many of the cases which have emerged in Greek courts, for example, have emerged as a result of cuts in social policy, pensions, and the like, as a result of the financial crisis. So to conclude, part 5, what I call the enduring paradox of cause and effect in terms of democracy and the EU. So we start off with cause. It has been the member states which have shaped the present configuration of EU interinstitutional power. And that configuration is beset by the democratic deficit, as identified by Joseph Weiler and Miguel Maduro, insofar as there's scant connection between electoral vote and political power or responsibility, with the consequence that it's difficult for the voters to express a view as to the direction of EU policy that will be translated into action. Member states bear the principal responsibility for the status quo because they made it, remade it, and continue to adhere to it over 60 years. Effect, cause and effect. The effect captures, in this sense, the way in which we think about democratic legitimation in the EU, or the way in which it's often thought about. The infirmities in the EU decision-making constitute the driver, the catalyst, the rationale for the argument that EU legitimacy and democracy must be grounded in the member states, not merely as one mode of representation within the EU. The argument becomes, as I said on the slide, more visceral and foundational in the sense that it is the member states and the national parliaments therein that are regarded as the true bedrock of democracy. The paradox resides in the conjunction of cause and effect. Member state choice is central to the institutional architecture at EU level and the democratic infirmity that is reflected therein. Note here, and this is truly part of the paradox, the infirmity cannot definitionally be resolved at EU level, given the nature of the choice thus made by the member states, with the consequence that the solution must be found elsewhere. And the paradox is heightened or exacerbated by reason of the fact that most national parliaments would or are in accord with their national executives in resisting change that would alleviate the democratic deficit within the EU because of the effect that this would have on their own power. The paradox is all the more important because it comes with a political bite, and this is doubly undermining for the EU. First political bite, the member states prefer always to offload blame concerning deficiencies in EU decision-making to the EU institutions themselves and divest themselves of responsibility. They do not readily concede their role as institutional architects of the status quo, even though they manifestly are. The second political bite is this. It is these very institutional deficiencies that serve to rob the EU of the legitimacy that it requires to tackle difficult social or economic issues. The EU is truly caught between a rock and a hard place, berated in equal measure for its over-attachment to the economic sphere at the expense of the social, while castigated for lacking the democratic legitimacy to make dispositive social or redistributive decisions. That's the true dilemma of the EU wherein we reside at present. The particular crises, whether rule of law crisis, migration crisis, or financial crisis, are all sub-parts of this. But until we have the courage to rethink these foundational issues, then we are never going to have an EU which is truly fit for the purposes which we would like to assign to it. Thank you very much indeed. I think it is possible that we might see some further movement towards a two-speed Europe. The issue has been on the table off and on for a long time. It's come back on the table to some extent because of Macron. The newly appointed Spanish Prime Minister, I think, is a supporter of the EU and has the same kind of feelings about it as Macron. So there is the possibility of a revival of thinking of a two-speed Europe. However, I think what's also interesting is that the Macron-type thinking of a two-speed Europe does not in itself address the kinds of issues that I was talking about. The two-speed Europe which is being spoken about is a two-speed Europe which is primarily substantively driven. So the differentiation between the fast speed or the fast track and the slower track is about how much substantive policy commitments are you going to accept. So, the second track would be non-Euro states. It might be states who don't want to accept various tax reforms or tax policy at the EU, but it's basically substantively driven. The Macron reforms do not, as such, at least as presently articulated, contemplate in the first speed changes to the institutional architecture which would invest decision-making within that first speed with the democratic legitimacy that a Weiler or a Maduro would like to see. So in other words, I think even within a Macron speed one, you're going to get more substantive policy commitment, but it's policy commitment still with the member states very firmly in the driving seat about the direction and speed of that change. So that's the answer to I think, the first part of your question. In terms of second-order consequences or third-order consequences, again, a good question. Always difficult to prognosticate accurately about that kind of thing when in an institution like the EU, when so many things are happening at the same time. But I think that the very way you put the question is informed and well judged, which is that I think it really does. I think there's going to be some tipping point in relation to some countries, whether it's Poland or Hungary, and they're going to have to make choices about the extent to which they are still willing to adhere to some of the basic foundational values on which the EU rests. Now, it's perfectly possible within a body like the EU, and indeed it's to be regarded as praiseworthy that within a body like the EU we have a plurality of values. We don't always have to go down the same road at the same speed. We can have different cultural values, etc. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There's a whole ton of literature about this. All of that is correct, and yet at the same time there has to be an adherence to a common core of values in order for a state to remain a member of the EU. And there would be a tipping point at which, I don't think we'd reach that, but there could be a tipping point in which a state then had to make a decision about whether it really was, the state and the rest of the EU would have to make decisions about whether that state really was still committed in that respect. I mean, of course, more generally, the rise of populism in its different manifestations in different national elections in member states, most notably and most recently in Italy, adds a further big problem in this respect. And sorry to give a long-winded answer to your question, but it seems to me that the very fact that in the third biggest economy in Europe, you end up, or third or fourth biggest economy, you end up with a combination of the League and the Five Star Movement, which are both basically in varying degrees anti-European, as running the government, I think, if anything, makes the emergence of a two-speed system less likely. If you have one of the major players like Italy, I mean, it doesn't prevent it as a matter of a priori logic, but as a matter of functional practicing politics, if you've got a country like Italy, which is not going to be signed on board within within the first speed. And it's hard to see how Italy, with the present government, would sign on to the first speed. Then it's difficult, in practical political terms, to see how it would actually move ahead. Thank you. Two testing questions. And two very good questions as well. Thank you. So on the first question, if I could guess accurately or foresee the future with accuracy in relation to Italy, I would not be a poor, impoverished academic, and I would have made a lot of money in one way or another by playing the markets and bond prices, etc. I don't have that kind of acuity or insight or foresight. I just don't. I don't think, I don't know what's going to happen. I've got friends and colleagues in Italy, quite a lot, good friends and colleagues, and I was actually very shocked. I was actually shocked by the outcome. I didn't realize it was going to happen, and I think even they were less shocked by the outcome, but they were shocked by the size of the win, as it were, and the diminution of Renzi's party. Do I think Italy is going to leave? No, not at the moment. I don't think you can have whatever the word would be, Italexit or whatever, I don't think you're going to have the equivalent of Brexit in Italy. I don't actually think Italy is going to leave the euro either, even though there's been rumblings about that by Savona, the economic savant, as it were, of those parties. I don't think it's going to happen, partly because the economic consequences for Italy would be disastrous. In terms of the borrowing costs for its debt would rapidly go through the ceiling. Standard macroeconomic thought is that most countries can't sustain interest payments on debt levels once they go above. They can't sustain them for any period of time once they go above about 6%. And if Italy left the euro, then I think that the interest payments on its debt would soar way above that, with tremendous negative consequences for the finances in Italy. So I don't think they're going to do that. Even though Savona had a plan as to how Italy would exit the euro, he has this plan which he'd written up. You close all the banks, prevent a flight of capital, all that. I just don't think they're going to do it. I may well be wrong. And I don't think they're going to leave the EU. I think they're going to create lots of problems at a more mundane, day-to-day level about the shape and direction of EU policy and the implementation of EU policy, and I think that's going to cause headaches for everyone. That's the first one. On the second one, Achmea, I was smiling when you asked the question, and I was smiling because I'm only hesitating because basically for various reasons, I've had to be upfront and personal with that decision and read it in a great deal of detail because of various consultancy work that I have done. What I can say as well is that in relation to one of these pieces of consultancy work, without giving any of the details which I can't give, in relation to one of these pieces of consultancy work, one of the issues that was being addressed was precisely the issue in Achmea, a year before Achmea had come down, and before the AG's opinion had come down. and I produced an opinion which mirrored almost exactly the kind of reasoning that the ECJ did adopt in Achmea. I said, I think they're going to find these clauses unlawful, and I think they're going to find them unlawful under EU law for this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason, which tracked very closely the kind of reasoning based on Article 344 and 367 and 267, etc., which is found in the reasoning in Achmea. So I do know about the case, and I do have thoughts about it. Just in terms of the pure ratio of the case is fairly, this was the full court. This wasn't a chamber, and it was the full court going head on, diametrically opposed to the opinion of the AG, which they ignored. The opinion, as you know, the opinion of the AG went the other way. The court basically ignored the opinion of the AG and just took a completely different view. And they meant it. You don't get a full court making a decision of that kind, which goes flat against the opinion of the AG without, they don't do this by chance. They meant it, and they meant it for the reasons that they set out clearly. Now, I accept that people, whenever you've got a major decision by the CJ EU of this kind, people will have differing views about the logic of the argument and the policy of the implications and the normative implications. They're going to do that. That's necessarily the case. Having said that, I see my own view is that I see real force in the kinds of argument which informed the court's reasoning and conclusion. And the conclusion does mean that an intra-EU BIT, a clause in an intra-EU BIT, which contains an arbitration clause of the kind that was in Achmea and exists in, I think, about 190 other BITs, give or take one or two, one way or the other. I think that the straightforward conclusion is they are contrary to EU law. That then leads to all sorts of interesting questions about remedial consequences of that. But I think that's what the judgment says. I've written about this in other contexts. I think it did play a role, and I think your question's a very good one too. I think it really did play a role in the following sense. When we had the referendum debates in the UK about whether we should leave or not, so the Remain camp was in a sense very much on the back foot. On the back foot in the sense of it felt that the only claim that it could put, the only sound claim it felt that it could put for staying in the EU was a purely economic one. If we leave, we'll be worse off. I think we will be worse off. I really do. But they never felt capable of putting any positive view or vision about the benefits of the EU in more positive terms. And I think that really hurt the Remain campaign, and I'm not the only one who thought that. There's quite a lot of literature about this and comment about this dimension of it too. And it hurt, and they felt they couldn't do that for two reasons. One is, and both of which I touched on in the lecture in different ways, one is that the UK government, like every other government, it wants to take the praise when things go well and offload the blame on the EU when things go badly, even if the thing which has gone badly is the very thing they voted for in Brussels and supported in Brussels. And Juncker was absolutely right after the referendum, after the result in the referendum, when Juncker said, is it surprising that this happens when you've been bad-mouthing us, as it were, all this time for things that you shaped and you bore responsibility for, but won't accept the responsibility now. And this is, you are bearing the fruits of what you are bearing, the fruits of the seeds which you have sown in those circumstances. So I think the failure to acknowledge that the member states are the architects of the institutional status quo, the failure to accept that, for example, take another example, the failure to accept that the root cause of the financial crisis was an asymmetry in the powers that the EU had over economic union and monetary union, with the consequence that the EU never had sufficient control over national fiscal policy to make monetary policy a viable option for the EU. So in a sense, the financial crisis was in that sense a train wreck waiting to happen at some stage or another, any time after Maastricht. Now, the Maastricht asymmetrical provisions about economic union and monetary union were once again quite simply shaped by the member states. They wanted a monetary union. They thought they could get away with a monetary union with an economic union attached to it, where the economic union was minimalist in the sense of there was only very, very limited national EU control over national fiscal policy and fiscal debt. And everything post-2010 has been the EU trying to play catch-up in that respect and tighten and increase the rules over the EU's oversight over national budgetary rules. So once again, that was member state choice. Did the member states, were they willing to say, mea culpa? Yeah, we are primary responsible for the institutional architecture which led to the financial crisis? Of course they're not going to do it. They never do. But it does seem to me, and I've written in this vein as well, I think that we, governments have a national constitutional responsibility. And I use those words advisedly, a constitutional responsibility to be open and honest with the populace. I mean, national governments extol the virtues of transparency and honesty and all that kind of stuff, except when it's difficult and when then they want to hide the ball and pretend that they never had, that it was nothing to do with them. You can't do that. I've been asked many things. I'm not quite sure I've ever been asked to draft a constitution while I'm standing at a podium, but still. We could, of course, just lock the doors and call in for pizza or the Latvian equivalent, and we could all draft the constitution. Why put the burden entirely on me? Actually, I think that first, what I would do, very briefly, in answering your question, which is a really serious question as well as amusing, the two aren't inconsistent. I think what I would do, I'd start off, at least in institutional architectural terms, by going back to the constitutional treaty. I'd have a separate part of the Constitution, which is truly part one, which contains the constitutional principles. So whatever they might be, they would be separate, yeah? And they would be there distinct from the sort of main substantive policy bit. I mean, the TEU, the present TEU, has some of the constitutional principles, but many of the constitutional principles under Lisbon are also contained in the TFEU. I'm rather kind of a more purist in this sense. I'd kind of just like them all in that first part. And then, okay, so that's just the beginning. And then what I'd say is, I'd sit the member states down and say, and talk about the kind of things that I was talking about in this lecture, in the sense of, okay, let's make a choice, all right? I mean, if given that that this institution is exercising a considerable amount of power, and that therefore should be invested with some democratic legitimacy. How far are you really willing to go down that path? All right? And let's just be totally honest and open about this. And you're still the architects of the treaty, and let's think this through as clearly and cleanly as possible. Okay? And be transparent and open about it. And then don't beef about whatever conclusion you come to. Do not beef there afterwards about the EU having a democratic deficit as if that was somebody else's problem. Okay? You're the creator. Work out how much parliamentary autonomous choice you're willing to give to the EU, and then write it as elegantly and as clearly as possible. That's how at least I would start. I think it's right that the European Council should be subject to the CJEU. The whole idea of a democracy based on, or a polity based on the rule of law, is indeed that no institution should be out with the law or should have freedom. Every institution should be subject to the possibility of judicial review, and that was really the story of changes made to Article 263. But look, the reality is that most times the influence of the European Council is not felt or does not take effect through a particular decision made by the European Council, which is a formal legal decision which might then be reviewed or not, as the case may be, under Article 263. Normally what the role of the European Council is very real but different. It's either giving the direction, strategic direction to European policy, or it's giving its view and asserting what the priorities in EU policy should be. But more importantly, on an everyday basis, what tends to happen is this. What tends to happen is this, is that the Commission will have a policy area that it wants to develop. It will test that with the individual member states through preparatory documents. Then when it's got enough certainty about what it wants to do, it will take the proposals to the European Council for the approval, for the imprimatur of the European Council, for the sign-off for the European Council. The European Council, it will have done its homework first. It's not going to, unlikely to take stuff there which the European Council is going to reject. It happens, but it's unlikely. But then what happens is that the European Council says to the Commission, good, now you go ahead and frame specific legislation or decisions to effectuate this policy, to bring into effect this particular policy, whatever the policy is. It might be about the environment, it might be about health, it might be about an aspect of financial services, whatever. And the European Commission will then do that, secure with the knowledge that it's got the approval from the highest political institution in the EU. But the measures themselves will then be measures which are either Commission decisions or they're measures enacted via the ordinary legislative procedure in the normal manner. And then if anyone wants to review those, then the challenge is to the particular piece of legislation under 289 or the Delegated Act under 290, etc. And whether someone can challenge it or not under 263 depends. If they're a privileged institution, no problem with standing. If they're an individual claimant, then you've got still all the problems with Article 263, para 4. So the bottom line is, yes, the European Council is formally reviewable, but it is not most of the time, it is not making the formal legal decisions which are subject to review. I think there are precisely in the kind of scenario that you painted, there are often difficulties in the EU because of the interaction between the institutions. And particularly the interaction, so quite often what you'll have is strong recommendations or guidelines coming from one particular institution which are really the driving force behind a decision made by a different institution, or they're still soft law, but they affect the nature of policy and policy choices in a particular area. And this is an issue which arises not only in relation to the European Council, but it's an issue which arises also in relation to things like the Eurogroup, which is an incredibly powerful group, and it's the classic instance, the Eurogroup now is the classic instance of a group where its legal clothes, as defined by the treaty articles, no longer fit its political power. The political power exceeds the legal clothing. And there are then real problems in these types of cases about who you bring an action against and whether you can match legal responsibility with legal power. And I don't think that the CJEU always gets it right in this respect. So a good example in relation to the Eurogroup was the big decision in the Malice case, where in effect the Eurogroup were the ones pulling all the strings in relation to what happened in that case. The claimants couldn't bring an action directly against the Eurogroup because because it wasn't making a formal decision, or it didn't have legal personality, etc. They were forced to then try and contrive a decision against the Commission or the bank, and that didn't work for various reasons. So I think that there are some real problems within the EU about ensuring a fit between the repository of legal power and legal responsibility. I repeat what I said earlier. I agree that there is a problem of the kind that Joseph and Miguel Maduro have articulated, and other people as well. I'm not denying that. I'm merely saying that where I get off the bus, as it were, where I differ is ascription of responsibility for that, because I think it is wrong in terms of historical causality and circumstance to portray the EU, in terms of the EU institutions themselves, Parliament or Commission or whatever, as wanting the kind of architecture that we presently have. And unless we get all that straight at the beginning, what I called the first theme of the lecture, then it seems to me that we're never going to be in a... Honesty about the first theme of the lecture is a condition precedent for even beginning to resolve the questions, or what I call the four constraints in the second part of the lecture. The impact of Brexit on the other member states is, it's not going to be, it's not a single impact. I think it's going to have various impacts on other, or is having and has had and will have various impacts. I mean, one impact that Brexit had was almost immediately after Brexit, the figures for voter satisfaction with Europe went up. Okay? There was this kind of, huggy-feely, these guys are leaving, we love you still, increase the feeling amongst voters. It really went up. And actually one of the many paradoxes and awful things about Brexit is that the figures of voter satisfaction with the EU after Brexit were only about 3 points behind the average in the rest of Europe. In which case you think, what is going on? You know, what is happening to all these people who voted to leave? So one dimension, one effect of Brexit, you know, is to make people, you know, when something gets a good kicking from someone, then other people rally round and say, we love you, you know, you're still loved, don't worry about it, etc. Or do worry about it, but you're still loved. I think a second impact, though, which is going to be more medium and long term, is that other states will be fully cognizant of the extreme difficulty of leaving. I mean, you know, I'm tied up with this all the time, not all the time. I mean, I could spend my entire academic career doing nothing more than writing about Brexit. I mean, I've already written about 6 different pieces about Brexit. And I could spend my entire... I'm not going to do that because, you know, you've got to keep things in perspective, and I want a life outside of all that, and I do have a life outside of all that. But I could spend pretty much my whole life writing about that because the issues are, there are many difficult political, economic, and pure legal issues. And anyone on the inside of the negotiations, or anyone who knows about EU law and is observing these negotiations from another member state would say, wow, you know, the cost in every sense of leaving and the difficulties of leaving are protean and enormous, and they are. And that's even leaving aside what gets put on top of that, and what gets put on top of that are political divisions at the national level. So leaving by itself is very complex. And then inevitably what you get are divisions as of the kind that we're seeing on a daily basis within the British cabinet as to the kind of way in which we should be leaving and the terms on which we should be leaving. I mean, our cabinet in that sense, you know, Theresa May is just having continually to hold together people with very different views about that and facing down rebellions every kind of single day about that. In the last couple of days, doing the same thing in relation to the backstop for a customs arrangement. So I think that would not be lost on other member states. And I think a third thing, and then I'll stop, a third dimension is other states will look keenly at the final trade deal, which the UK manages to secure with the EU. And that will have a very, I think, significant impact on their mental appreciation, their view, their vision about what exit from the EU means. Because I actually don't think you're going to, I think although the government has said for political reasons we don't want to be in the single market, we don't want to be in the customs union, but we want a relationship which is as frictionless as possible. Frictionless is the go-to word at the moment. When you can't think of anything else to say, you say you want it to be a frictionless relationship. That's fine, except it's not going to happen. Because, I mean, from the EU side, they're not going to give you by the back door what you said you're not going to accept by the front door. So they're not going to give you the benefits of being in the single market by the side door or the back door, and they're not going to give you anything akin there too. Why would they? It's irrational. So, well, I mean, I think that's a nice and easy question to finish on. You should study it for both pragmatic and for intellectual reasons. If you want the pragmatic, it doesn't matter which way around you take them. They're both equally important. Pragmatic reasons first. If you want to be a lawyer out there and practice, and you know nothing about EU law, then you are very significantly hampering the kind of legal job you can do. Because if you're in a legal firm of any size at all, or you're advising a corporation of any size at all, then it's almost certainly going to be doing business in Europe. And if you know nothing about EU law, and if you can't distinguish between a directive and a regulation and a hole in the wall, then you are very unlikely to remain the legal representative of that corporation for very long. So in practical terms, you just need to know it because it's an important body of law. But not just for trade, but also if you're just dealing with contracts, or you're dealing with delict, if you're dealing with aspects of family law, if you're dealing with aspects of corporate securities law, all of this has, and all of these areas have an EU dimension. And of course, a lawyer who's never done any EU law could try and work out what's going on if they're smart, and they could probably get to the answer. But that's like running a race where you're starting 500 meters behind somebody else. And if you're the client and you're the corporate client, why would you go to a lawyer who's starting 500 meters behind somebody else who's very smart and who's starting 500 meters ahead? So in practical terms, it's very important. In intellectual terms, it's very interesting. I mean, this, it just has, almost any level, whether it's the normative level, the conceptual level, the analytical level, there are interesting questions, really interesting questions, purely legal questions, which affect and infect every part of EU law, from the kind of constitutional type of issues I was looking at here to much more analytical issues. And equally, finally, I think in answer to the question, it would be, what's pretty remarkable about the EU is that it's still rocking and rolling. Here's an institution which has had to weather shocks, in inverted commas, exogenous and endogenous, of a kind which might well have driven other institutions onto the rocks, and it manages to find a way through, and that's a really interesting feature. And akin to that is that it finds a way through, and while it does so, it continues to do business in the sense of the EU is actually, people who know nothing about the EU or know little about it make all sorts of assumptions which are nonsense. The EU is actually a pretty efficient legislative machine. It gets business done. Compared to Congress in the United States, it's amazing. It gets business done every day of the week. During the decade of treaty reform of the first decade of the new millennium, it was getting business done in terms of, there were a steady flow of policy initiatives, perfectly sensible policy initiatives about financial services and goodness knows what else. And it manages to do that in circumstances of producing a directive on subject X and brokering agreement sufficient to bring 28 member states on board for that directive. And it does it again and again and again and again, and that's a pretty significant achievement for any polity.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for attending the lecture, and see you next year.